Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back into the crowded heart of a medieval marketplace, a place where mud clings to boots, bells jingle on pack animals, and bread sellers yell louder than anyone else. You, however, are not here for bread or cheese, or even the sweet pastries dusted with sugar that would tempt most weary travelers. You are here because you are about to witness the strange, wonderful, and sometimes downright ridiculous world of medieval fashion, the kind of style choices that make you wonder whether people in the 14th century secretly had the same sense of humor as a costume designer on a very low-budget comedy film. And honestly, you probably would not survive in these outfits, because even walking across the street in them required skill, balance, and perhaps a full-time assistant. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And since we are all time travelers tonight, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing who is drifting off in New Zealand at sunrise, or who is curled up in Canada at midnight with a blanket pulled over their head. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself stepping carefully onto cobblestones slick with yesterday's rain, and the first thing you notice is a pair of shoes so long they could double as fishing poles. They are called poulaines, or krakows, and the nobleman wearing them is doing his very best to look dignified while clearly fighting the laws of physics. His toes stretch out in front of him nearly 2 feet, curling slightly upward at the end like a clown shoe with ambition. These shoes were once the peak of fashion, the longer the better, though the church frowned upon them, and city councils occasionally tried to ban them after too many people tripped into fountains. The man beside you whispers that once the shoes were stuffed with moss or horsehair to keep their shape, because heaven forbid a floppy shoe tip suggest weakness. The absurdity of it becomes even more obvious when a child darts across the street and the nobleman attempts to step aside gracefully, only to nearly trip over his own footwear. He catches himself, scowling, and continues with the stiff pride of someone who knows he looks ridiculous, but refuses to admit it. You cannot help but wonder if cobblers secretly laughed every time a noble requested an extra few inches of toe length, as if compensating for something historians still politely debate. There is a rumor here in town that one king's shoes were so extravagant that he had to have a servant walk ahead of him, carefully lifting the tips to prevent accidents. Historians still wonder if this story is exaggerated, or if there truly were nobles whose footwear doubled as medieval booby traps. Either way, you imagine tripping into a banquet hall while wearing them, tumbling into a roast goose, and forever being remembered not as a knight or scholar, but as that fellow with the very long shoes who ruined dinner. A woman in simpler but still oddly charming footwear passes by, and you notice that even peasants sometimes wore poulaines, though theirs were shorter, more practical, barely peeking out a few inches past the toes. They might not have tripped on staircases, but they still had to wipe off the mud that gathered at the ends. You suddenly realize how impractical all this must have been during winter. Imagine trudging through snow with icy slush, frozen to the tips of your shoes, turning every step into a small battle. The town crier announces new ordinances, and among the rules is one about shoe length, a gentle reminder from the council that no one's toes should extend beyond 12 inches. 12 inches. Imagine your modern sneakers suddenly outlawed for being too expressive. The crowd groans, some laughing, others muttering about fashion being ruined by meddling officials. You suspect the shoemakers are secretly delighted. Laws like this mean guaranteed business when nobles rush to order new pairs that pass regulation. As you drift deeper into the market, the clattering of hooves and the smell of roasted chestnuts fill the air. But your mind keeps circling back to those shoes. They are more than a strange fashion choice. They are symbols of status, wealth, and a curious human tendency to exaggerate whatever is popular until someone finally says, "Enough, that is silly." People wanted to stand out, to display their confidence, to show they had the means to waste leather on pointless length. And perhaps you think not much has changed. Modern sneakers are not stuffed with moss, but people still wait in long lines for limited editions, proving that fashion in every century is less about practicality and more about the story you tell with your feet. You follow the uneven cobblestones away from the shoe stalls and turn into a lively square where music drifts faintly from a minstrel with a lute. And it is here that your eyes are pulled upward, quite literally, because someone is wearing a hat so tall you wonder if it could scrape the underside of the clouds. It is a hennin, a cone-shaped headdress often associated with noblewomen of the later medieval period, sometimes so long and pointed that people joked it could double as a jousting lance. And the woman wearing this particular one has attached a gauzy veil that ripples behind her like a banner on a windy day, which is impressive until the breeze suddenly shifts and nearly knocks her sideways, forcing a companion to steady her with all the solemnity of someone preventing a very expensive tent pole from toppling. Historians accept that hennins were indeed worn by elite women in places like Burgundy and France during the 15th century, though depictions in manuscripts suggest some hennins may have been far taller in art than in reality. And yet here, in the square you stand in, you are confronted with a woman straining her neck muscles as though fashion itself were a kind of medieval gym membership. And you imagine that every time she tried to sit down to dinner, she would risk knocking over a candle or accidentally spearing a roast chicken. Children run behind her giggling as her veil whips dramatically, while an older man mutters that women used to wear modest wimples that framed the face politely, and now they walk around looking like human spires. The town gossip claims that one noblewoman, S. Hennin, grew so tall that she needed to tilt her head just to enter her own doorway. And although historians still debate whether the most extreme examples in artwork were exaggerations, you are watching this one teeter dangerously every time the wearer turns too quickly, making you wonder whether fashion here was secretly designed by chiropractors who wanted more business. You step aside as she attempts to squeeze through the narrow entry of a stall selling spiced nuts, and the veil tangles briefly in a hanging basket before she untangles herself with the patient dignity of someone used to being a mobile landmark. You realize that the hennin is not just a hat, but a status symbol, a way of saying, I can afford yards of fabric and the scorn of my neighbors, because each veil needed fine material, often imported silk, and the tall cone required skilled stiffening techniques with parchment or wire. The practical side of you whispers that it would have been a nightmare to travel with. Imagine trying to ride in a carriage or climb stairs without poking someone's eye out. But the storyteller in you admires the commitment, because humans across all ages have always chased ways to look taller, grander, more imposing, whether it was platform shoes in modern runways or these medieval head towers. The woman finally stops at a stall selling jewelry, and you cannot help but notice that she leans forward cautiously, calculating how far she can tilt without unbalancing. And you wonder whether dinners in her household require servants to discreetly hold her hennin in place while she slurps her soup. There is a widely repeated story that clerics scolded women for hennins, declaring them proud, sinful, and foolishly wasteful. Though you suspect that the sermons did little more than encourage people to build even taller ones out of sheer defiance, because the more authorities said, do not wear that, the more fashion became an act of playful rebellion. You are tempted to ask her how heavy it feels, but before you can, another lady arrives, and her hennin is not a cone, but a truncated version, flat at the top, which looks a bit like someone cut off the end of a wizard's hat, and she wears it with the satisfaction of someone choosing practicality while still maintaining flair. You overhear a baker-as apprentice whisper that some ladies placed birds or even fruit decorations on top, a detail you find difficult to imagine but not impossible, because if people were willing to embroider shoes with pearls, why not add a pair to a hat? The wind shifts again, and the taller hennin sways like a ship's mast, her companion rushing once more to hold it upright. And you have to bite back a laugh, because you suddenly picture medieval towns filled with fashionable women, tottering about like ships in a storm, veils billowing, children chasing behind to catch scraps of fabric. Historians still wonder how often these hennins were worn in everyday life compared to formal events, because surviving records focus on courtly circles, not marketplaces like the one you are wandering through. But tonight you are here to witness one in action, defying physics, logic, and the patience of the woman's companion. As you watch the pair disappear into the crowd, you realize that medieval fashion was rarely just clothing. It was performance, theater woven into daily life, each hat or robe a statement that echoed long after the fabric itself had worn away. And you find yourself smiling at the thought that centuries later, people like you would still be looking up, literally and figuratively, at the tallest hats of the Middle Ages. You stroll further into the market, the echoes of clattering hennins fading behind you, and soon your attention is caught not by the shape of clothing, but by the dazzling colors that swirl through the square like a living rainbow. Each shade carrying more weight than you realize at first, because in the medieval world, color is not simply a matter of taste, it is law, it is hierarchy. It is the difference between being fined by a stern guard or being admired by every passing noble. You notice at once the deep violet tunic of a merchant standing proudly near his wares, and you hear a pair of townsfolk whisper in disapproval, because purple in many places is a shade reserved for royalty or the highest nobility, often made from dyes so expensive that wearing it without permission was a literal crime, the kind that could cost you money, reputation, or both. The dye that produces such richness often comes from rare sources like the glands of tiny sea snails in antiquity or the labor-intensive plants of medieval Europe, which makes every inch of purple cloth worth a small fortune. So when you see this merchant strut about in it, you understand the daring statement, and perhaps also the risk, because you half expect a guard to tap him on the shoulder and hand him a fine. Historians agree that sumptuary laws, those strict rules about who could wear what, were widespread across Europe from the 13th century onward, designed to maintain social order by making sure peasants stayed visually different from nobles. But humans being humans, people often found clever ways to bend or outright break those rules. As you edge closer to the merchant's stall, you notice a dyer hunched over, his hands permanently stained with blue and green, and he mutters that the secret to some colors is not royal decree, but clever chemistry. For instance, woad plants for blue, saffron for yellow, madder roots for red, and even ground insects for certain vivid shades, which makes you pause mid-step as you imagine a medieval tailor sprinkling crushed bugs into fabric to produce that glowing crimson trim. Your nose picks up the faint earthy tang of dye vats nearby, and it is almost comforting, though the dyer warns you not to get too close unless you want your boots to carry the smell for days. You cannot help but wonder about the psychology of color here, how a man in bright green might be signaling his youth and vigor, while a lady in muted browns might be judged as either humble or simply dull, and you realize that fashion was never silent, it spoke louder than words in every hue and thread. A group of children dash past in rough tunics dyed with onion skins and nettles, cheaper natural dyes that fade quickly, and yet their laughter is just as bright as the clothes of nobles, reminding you that for most of history, common people made do with whatever was available, often mixing dyes to create new shades no law had thought to regulate. The quirky detail comes when an older woman selling ribbons tells you in a hushed voice that some households kept secret recipes for dyes guarded more closely than family treasures, passing them down through generations like magical formulas, and she swears she once saw cloth that shimmered almost metallic under candlelight, though she admits she could have been dreaming, and you find yourself curious if lost colors might truly exist. Shades that once dazzled the eye but faded from both fabric and memory over the centuries. Historians still wonder about the enforcement of these laws, whether guards truly policed every street for rebellious color, or whether most fines were just tools for city councils to make money off ambitious merchants. And you glance back at the violet-clad man and notice no guard approaching, which makes you think that perhaps just as today, rules about clothing were more often broken with a wink than with fear. Your gaze shifts to another stall where a noblewoman displays a gown in brilliant scarlet, the fabric glowing as if alive, and you recall that in many places scarlet too was expensive, requiring cochineal or Kermes insects to produce such intensity, meaning that every fold of her gown represents thousands of tiny crushed lives, which makes you question whether fashion has always had a hidden cost. You brush your fingers lightly against a bolt of deep blue cloth, and the merchant slaps your hand away with mock irritation, reminding you that even touching could risk staining your skin, because the color still bleeds from fresh dye, and you laugh awkwardly, realizing that medieval fashion came with hazards beyond ridicule. It could literally stain your fingers for days. The bustle of the market swirls around you, banners flapping in the breeze, tunics of red, cloaks of green, shoes dyed black with soot, and you feel as if you are walking inside a painter's palette, each person a brushstroke in a larger portrait of hierarchy and ambition. You think about your own time, where people argue about brands and logos, and it strikes you that 1,000 years ago, the logo was simply the die itself, the color screaming silently of wealth or rebellion or aspiration. As the sun begins to dip and the shadows of tall hats and longer shoes stretch across the square, you find yourself marveling at the human urge to control and categorize even the hues of clothing. And you wonder, if a poor boy had somehow managed to find a scrap of royal purple cloth and stitched it secretly into his sleeve, would he have felt powerful or only afraid of being caught? And in that question you hear the heartbeat of fashion itself, a playful, daring, dangerous dance of colors across the centuries, still as vivid in your mind as the cloth billowing before your eyes now. In the medieval world, clothing was rarely a simple matter of slipping into a tunic and stepping outside. Instead, it was a process that could feel more like assembling an onion, one careful layer after another, until the wearer was both dignified and slightly suffocated, and anyone watching could only admire their patience or wonder why they did not simply give up and wear a sack. It usually began with the linen undergarments, the base layer that touched the skin, practical because linen could be washed more often than wool, and helped absorb sweat, though most people in the Middle Ages were not washing things nearly as often as you might hope. Over that came another shirt or kirtle, then a tunic, then perhaps a surcoat, and for those who wished to appear especially impressive, still another outer garment, sometimes trimmed in fur or embroidered with painstaking detail. Nobles might end up wearing 4 or 5 layers on an ordinary day, which might make sense in the chill of a drafty castle, but less sense on a warm afternoon in July. One accepted fact historians often emphasize is how central linen was to the entire system. Linen sheets, linen undergarments, linen veils, because unlike wool, it could be boiled clean, a rare blessing in a world where hygiene was more hope than habit. But beyond practicality came the performance, because each extra layer signaled wealth. The more fabric draped across your body, the more you displayed your ability to pay for cloth that others could barely afford. The curious detail emerges in accounts of courtiers who boasted not only about their outer garments, but also about how many layers lay hidden beneath, a kind of invisible bragging rights, as if saying, "You may not see my wealth, but know that I am sweating richly beneath these robes." Imagine the spectacle of a nobleman stripping off 3 layers at a feast, only to reveal another tunic still more finely woven beneath, as though he were an entertainer performing a fabric-based magic trick. Yet the question remains whether ordinary townsfolk truly admired these displays, or simply rolled their eyes and muttered about nobles wasting good wool that might have clothed 3 families. The endless layering had practical drawbacks, of course. Garments were heavy, and the simple act of walking could feel like wading through cloth, while sitting down at a table sometimes required assistance with servants, carefully smoothing each fold, so it did not bunch awkwardly beneath their master. Some chroniclers even joked about noblewomen being nearly immobile beneath all their skirts, rustling like paper whenever they tried to shift in their chairs. And still the fashion persisted, because no matter how awkward, the layers symbolized a life of abundance, a physical barrier between those who worked in fields and those who lived above such things. In modern terms, it was the medieval version of owning more shoes than one could ever wear. Impractical, slightly ridiculous, but entirely the point. And so as you imagine the scene of a banquet hall filled with nobles bundled in 4 or 5 layers, sweating quietly by candlelight, you cannot help but think of the irony. All that effort, all that expense, simply to look as though life was effortless. If clothing was a way of displaying one's status in medieval society, facial hair was no less a canvas for ambition, pride, and sometimes outright eccentricity. And to walk through the town square was to encounter not only a parade of robes and tunics, but also an entire gallery of beards shaped, trimmed, and styled as carefully as any piece of embroidery. In the earlier centuries, when knights clattered through streets in mail, and the church still thundered about worldly vanities, beards were often long and flowing symbols of manly strength and perhaps a little laziness. But as the centuries crept forward, the fashion for beards shifted dramatically, so that by the high and late Middle Ages, you might encounter a nobleman with a beard trimmed into a neat fork, pointed so sharply it seemed ready to spear an unsuspecting apple. Barber surgeons, those curious figures who cut hair and sometimes cut veins with equal confidence, became experts in shaping beards into all manner of designs, and to sit in their chair was as much a social ritual as a practical necessity. One accepted historical fact is that the forked beard, sometimes called a bifurcated style, was widely admired in the 14th century, immortalized in portraits of dignified men whose chins split into twin points like the tails of swallows, and such beards were even waxed to maintain their proud geometry. But alongside this rather serious fashion came a quirky detail. Some chronicles mention knights competing in beard-length contests, boasting about inches grown over seasons as if they were crops, and one Italian poet sneered at a rival whose beard was so exaggeratedly long that it dragged into his soup. The human image is easy to picture: a solemn lord bending forward at a feast, only to dunk his whiskers into a bowl of broth, lifting his head again with strands dripping like seaweed, pretending that nothing was amiss, while squires snickered behind their hands. Historians still wonder about the cultural weight of these styles, whether they were seen purely as masculine pride, or whether they also carried layers of symbolism we no longer quite grasp, such as associations with piety, wisdom, or even sorcery. After all, to wear a beard was not only to make a fashion statement, but also to broadcast an identity, in an age when faces themselves were considered moral indicators. In certain towns, sumptuary laws reached beyond clothes to regulate beards, insisting that only men of certain ranks could wear particular styles, a reminder that even whiskers could be political. In another curious contrast, the clean-shaven look came in and out of fashion repeatedly, so that a man who shaved entirely might be admired in one generation and scorned in the next, leaving us to imagine medieval barbers sighing as customers demanded the exact opposite of last year's style. The humor of it all is hard to miss: men spending hours preening their beards only to ride out into dusty roads where mud and smoke clung to every whisker, or soldiers entering battle where one good swing of a sword could undo months of careful trimming. And yet, the symbolism endured. A well-kept beard suggested order, discipline, and power, while a neglected one could suggest poverty, eccentricity, or even sanctity, since certain monks deliberately let theirs grow wild as a rejection of worldly vanity. Perhaps the most striking thought is how much emotional energy went into these whiskers: noblemen twirling, shaping, oiling, and even perfuming their beards, while peasants working the fields simply let theirs grow however it wished, indifferent to fashion, because survival mattered more than symmetry. And so in the flickering torchlight of a medieval tavern, where you might find merchants gossiping and knights boasting the sight of a beard shaped to perfection, was not just a grooming choice, but a small drama, a declaration of taste, and perhaps a secret anxiety, for even then as now trends could shift with a whisper, leaving today's proud style tomorrow's foolish relic. By the time the 15th century rolled into fashion, clothing in Europe had already passed through countless transformations, but few developments were as memorable or as baffling to modern eyes as the sudden appearance of the codpiece, that curious addition to men's garments, which seems at first glance like a practical patch, and very quickly becomes an exaggerated billboard of pride, humor, and questionable dignity. The story begins innocently enough, with men's hose, those tight-fitting leggings that came in two separate pieces, one for each leg, joined together at the waist, but leaving an awkward gap in the middle, and for a while men covered this gap with long tunics or surcoats, modestly hiding what did not need to be displayed. But as fashion grew shorter, tunics cropped higher, leaving that gap increasingly noticeable, and necessity demanded a solution. Thus, the codpiece was born. At first, a simple triangular flap of fabric, tied or buttoned in place to preserve modesty. Yet, in a way that feels almost inevitable, modesty turned into exhibition, and before long, codpieces swelled into padded, ornamented, and boldly protruding accessories that became the talk of courts and taverns alike. One widely accepted fact is that by the reign of Henry VIII in England, codpieces had reached their peak of extravagance, stuffed to the point of absurdity, sometimes slashed open to show off contrasting fabrics, or decorated with embroidery, jewels, even tassels, so that what had begun as a patch of convenience transformed into one of the most flamboyant statements of masculine fashion in history. And here comes the quirky detail that never fails to raise an eyebrow. Codpieces were sometimes used as literal pockets, sewn large enough to carry coins, trinkets, and in some surviving examples, small prayer books, meaning that a man could quite literally store his valuables in his most conspicuous compartment. The image is both comical and strangely practical. A courtier reaching down with absolute seriousness to retrieve a coin while everyone around pretends that nothing at all is unusual about this transaction. Historians still wonder about the cultural meanings layered into the codpiece. Was it purely an outrageous symbol of virility, a physical boast worn into every feast hall, or did it carry subtler signals of power and wealth and armored confidence padded in silk? We may never know entirely, but contemporary satires suggest that not everyone admired the fashion. Pamphlets and poems mocked men who strutted about like peacocks, and some clerics denounced the codpiece as sinful pride made cloth. Still, the trend spread widely, and as you picture a medieval festival or parade, you can imagine a row of noblemen stepping proudly forward, their codpieces jutting out like the bows of tiny ships, each one larger or flashier than the last, while spectators whispered, laughed, or rolled their eyes depending on their temperament. The humor of it is impossible to ignore, yet beneath it lies the same pattern seen again and again in fashion history. What begins as necessity turns into exaggeration, then into parody, and finally fades away when the next style takes over. The codpiece eventually shrank back into modesty by the 17th century, replaced by breeches and plainer forms of menswear. But for that brief shining period, it was not only tolerated but celebrated, painted into portraits of kings and courtiers, as if to say, "This is who I am, and I have no fear of looking ridiculous in pursuit of fashion." And perhaps that is the most human lesson of all, the lengths people will go to stand out, to impress, to laugh at one another and themselves, ensuring that centuries later we still remember the parade of codpieces, not with horror, but with a smile, marveling at the audacity of a world where clothing turned even the simplest problem into a performance of style. There is a particular strangeness in the way wealth insists on defying common sense, and few sights in medieval fashion illustrate this better than the nobleman wrapped in fur on a hot summer's afternoon, seated proudly in his carriage, while everyone else nearby is wilting in thin linen shirts and wiping sweat from their brows. Fur, after all, was not only a matter of warmth, but of rank, and if one could afford to line one's cloak with ermine, squirrel, or sable, then one did so regardless of the season, because it was not really about comfort. It was about sending a message. In the Middle Ages, fur was one of the clearest symbols of luxury, often imported from far-off lands, costly to acquire, and associated with power, dignity, and occasionally sheer stubborn vanity. So when chronicles describe kings and queens in gowns lined entirely with ermine, one can imagine the dazzling white pelts stitched together, each tiny black-tipped tail forming a pattern recognizable from across a hall. An accepted fact is that sumptuary laws frequently restricted fur. Certain types were reserved for royalty or for the highest-ranking nobles, while lesser officials might be allowed only local or cheaper varieties, such as rabbit or cat, which still carried warmth but not prestige. Yet the curious detail comes in the form of summer usage, when nobles insisted on wearing their heavy fur-trimmed cloaks during feasts or processions, even when temperatures soared, creating spectacles where courtiers fanned themselves furiously, beads of sweat dripping down their foreheads. But no one dared remove the garment because to do so would be to step down a rung of the social ladder in plain view. There are records of kings sweltering in parliament halls, their fur mantles dragging across the floor, while clerks and servants fainted from the heat, and still the fashion persisted, as though heatstroke was a small price to pay for dignity. Historians still wonder how practical these garments truly were. Did wearers genuinely sit through entire summers swaddled in fur, or were there lighter ceremonial versions for show, kept in place only for brief appearances? Whatever the reality, the image survives of nobles roasting beneath their own status symbols, unwilling to admit that a lighter cloak would make far more sense. One can imagine the humor of a medieval carriage rolling slowly through a festival crowd, the nobleman inside dabbing his brow with a lace handkerchief, while insisting that he felt perfectly comfortable, his servants struggling not to laugh as they dragged his fur-lined mantle behind him like a parade float. And yet, there was undeniable beauty in these garments, richly dyed outer layers trimmed with glossy pelts, the contrast of scarlet wool and white ermine making a striking impression, particularly when candlelight flickered across the fur in a great hall. To own fur was to belong to a world of privilege, and so nobles bore the inconvenience gladly, even proudly, knowing that a sweating noble in ermine was still more admired than a comfortable peasant in linen. At the same time, the ordinary townsfolk must have found it all a little ridiculous, watching wealthy figures puff and pant under layers they did not need, shaking their heads at the foolishness of vanity. Perhaps that is why fur became a frequent target of sermons and satire, mocked as excessive even as it remained desirable. And perhaps, too, that is why the image endures so vividly, not just because it was beautiful, but because it was slightly absurd, a reminder that humans will often choose to suffer a little if it means impressing everyone else. So as the carriage disappears down the cobbled street, the noble still wrapped in his luxurious mantle, while the air hums with the buzzing of summer flies, you can almost hear the unspoken thought behind his flushed face. Fashion, first, comfort never. If long-pointed shoes had already made medieval feet into a source of spectacle, the next chapter in the story of footwear came with pattens and clogs, those curious contraptions strapped beneath ordinary shoes to raise the wearer above the muck and mud of streets that were rarely as clean as one might like, so that walking across a marketplace became a performance of balance, sound, and sometimes embarrassment. Streets of the medieval town were often little more than uneven cobblestones, running with rainwater, spilled ale, and the occasional less mentionable substance, and so pattens provided a practical lift, wooden or metal platforms that clipped to the soles of shoes, protecting expensive leather from ruin. The practicality is undeniable, but what stays in memory is the noise, because every step in pattens produced a sharp clack against stone, a rhythm that echoed loudly in narrow alleys until it sounded as if the town itself had turned into a percussion orchestra. An accepted fact is that pattens were common across Europe from the 12th century onward, worn by both men and women, and even became associated with certain professions as cobblers and smiths, designed sturdier versions for workmen, while more delicate models appeared for ladies in gowns. But the quirky detail comes when you imagine the spectacle of a church filled with clattering footsteps, because people were encouraged to remove their pattens before entering so that sermons could proceed without sounding like they were being delivered in the middle of a marching band rehearsal. Even more amusing are accounts of lovers meeting in secret, their plans betrayed not by words, but by the distinct tapping of their pattens on the pavement outside, as if the shoes themselves whispered gossip through the night. There is something strangely human in that, the attempt to glide unnoticed through a darkened street, only to have your own footwear announce your every step to the world. Historians still wonder about how much dignity could really be preserved when nobles attempted to pair enormous hoop skirts or long-pointed poulaines with these clumsy platforms. Because balance must have been a constant challenge, and there are jokes in period literature about women stumbling into gutters or men slipping noisily on wet stones. The shoes carried symbolic weight too. The higher you were lifted from the ground, the more you seemed removed from the filth of ordinary life, so pattens became yet another quiet marker of status, though peasants also used them in simpler forms, proving that practicality sometimes blurred the lines of class. And yet the humor is irresistible. Imagine a procession of dignitaries parading through a street, their fur-lined cloaks dragging while their pattens strike in unison, creating a sound like an approaching army of wooden hammers. In an odd way, the sound itself became part of the medieval soundscape, as recognizable then as the hum of traffic is now, and one wonders whether people learned to identify acquaintances by their particular rhythm of steps. The more extravagant versions included high stilts that left wearers towering precariously above the ground, and illustrations suggest that these reached absurd heights in some cities, though whether this was exaggeration or truth remains uncertain. But whether high or low, noisy or discreet pattens and clogs remind us of a daily reality often forgotten, that medieval streets were messy, that fashion required not only fabric, but also contraptions to survive the mud, and that sometimes the most ordinary object, the shoe beneath the shoe, could become a source of both necessity and comedy. And so, as dusk settles over the town, you can almost hear them still. The clatter of pattens echoing down the alleyways, shoes that whispered secrets louder than any mouth ever dared. There are fashions that flatter, there are fashions that impress, and then there are fashions that simply take up space, and few medieval garments were as spatially ambitious as the early forms of hoop skirts, known in some regions as farthingales, or simply great skirts stiffened with reeds or whalebone so wide that a single wearer could block an entire doorway without even trying, creating situations that must have tested both patience and politeness. The idea was not entirely impractical in its origins, for structured skirts allowed fabric to drape elegantly without collapsing into wrinkles, and they created the impression of grandeur, a walking bell of silk and velvet that announced the wearer's presence long before her words ever did. But as so often happens in fashion, the practical soon turned into the extreme, and before long there were reports of women needing assistance to sit down because their skirts extended several feet to either side, so that lowering oneself into a chair was less a matter of bending gracefully and more of docking like a ship into harbor. One accepted fact is that by the late medieval and early Renaissance period, these structures grew so wide that in some Spanish courts they could measure several feet across, requiring architectural adjustments to seating arrangements and doorways, an extraordinary example of fashion literally reshaping the environment. The quirky detail comes in the form of everyday mishaps, like the woman who could not pass through a narrow church entrance and had to turn sideways, only to wedge herself firmly until her attendants managed to pull her free, or the feasting halls, where waiters cursed under their breath because moving between rows of skirts was like navigating a hedge maze made of fabric. Satirists had a field day with these contraptions, penning verses about ladies knocking over candlesticks with a careless swing of their hips or sweeping small dogs into corners. And it is hard not to smile at the thought of a crowded banquet where conversation pauses because someone has once again become stuck between the furniture. Historians still wonder about the daily practicality of such fashions, whether these enormous skirts were truly worn on ordinary streets or reserved for courts and ceremonies, and some argue that the most exaggerated depictions in paintings were artistic flourishes meant to emphasize wealth rather than accurate records. Still, enough descriptions survive to suggest that many women did indeed wrestle with their own clothing, carrying themselves with rigid dignity while servants managed the chaos of doors, stairs, and seating. The social meaning was clear. A skirt that occupied that much space was not only a garment but also a statement of untouchable status, a physical barrier that ensured no one could come too close without permission. It turned the wearer into a spectacle, admired, envied, mocked, and occasionally pitied, but always noticed. And yet the humor lingers most vividly in our imagination, the scene of a bustling hall brought to a halt as a hoop skirt sweeps through like a tide, knocking goblets and startling cats, while its wearer remains serenely unaware, or perhaps simply pretending not to notice. The human need to exaggerate, to push the boundaries of fabric and form, lies at the heart of such fashions, reminding us that beauty and inconvenience have always danced hand in hand. And so the image endures. A candlelit room, shadows flickering, and in the center a woman whose skirt is so vast that she becomes her own landscape, a mountain of silk that both delights and obstructs, leaving us to wonder how much of medieval elegance was truly admired and how much was endured with a quiet sigh. If the sight of medieval clothing could be overwhelming to the eyes, then the smell of medieval life was its own unforgettable dimension, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the realm of perfumes, where strong scents were often asked to perform the impossible task of covering for a world where bathing was infrequent, drains were primitive, and a warm summer's crowd could test even the most forgiving nose. To modern ears, it sounds strange to speak of a society that valued elaborate fashions, yet was sometimes reluctant to step into a bath, but water was often distrusted, associated with sickness, or simply inconvenient in towns where heating enough for immersion required extraordinary effort. Linen shifts could be washed true, but the body beneath them was often left to fend for itself longer than one might wish. And so perfume and scented waters became the allies of those who wanted to appear not only elegant but also tolerable at close quarters. It is a well-accepted fact that both men and women of the medieval elite used rosewater, lavender sage, and mixtures of herbs to create fragrant oils and powders, sometimes carried in pomanders, small perforated balls that released scent slowly as they dangled from a belt or chain. Yet the quirky detail comes in the form of how strong some of these perfumes were said to be not delicate whispers of fragrance, but powerful waves that could fill an entire hall, leaving guests coughing discreetly into their sleeves while nodding compliments. A chronicler once described a noblewoman so heavily perfumed that she left a trail behind her like incense in a church, and one can imagine servants tasked with refilling pomanders as though tending a smoking censer. Historians still wonder whether people truly believed these scents warded off illness, as medical theory of the time suggested that bad smells carried disease and good smells might protect against it, or whether the belief was a polite fiction that allowed people to justify their overwhelming clouds of fragrance. Either way, perfume was more than mere vanity. It was medicine, status, and sometimes weapon, for a poorly balanced mixture could be as offensive as the odor it was meant to hide. Picture a feast where lords and ladies arrive in their layered gowns, jewels glittering beards carefully forked, and before they even take their seats, the air is already heavy with competing aromas of musk, rosemary, civet, and clove, mingling with the roasted meats on the table until the room becomes a sensory labyrinth. Some guests surely admired the richness of it, while others likely longed for a breath of plain, fresh air, though to say so aloud would risk insulting one's host. Perfume was also a class marker, for while peasants might hang simple bundles of herbs around their homes or rub garlic on their boots to ward off pests, only the wealthy could afford the costly imported spices and oils that made a person not only smell sweeter, but also appear richer. The image grows amusing when one considers travelers in crowded inns, each wearing layers of scent so strong that the building itself must have smelled like a traveling apothecary cart. And one wonders how many friendships or romances began or ended because someone's perfume was just a little too enthusiastic. And yet there is beauty in the practice too, in the carefully distilled rose water, in the sachets of dried lavender sewn into garments, in the belief that smell could elevate the spirit as much as it masked the body. Perhaps the strongest thought to carry is that while medieval fashion dazzled the eyes, medieval perfume reminded the nose of the same truth. Elegance often comes with inconvenience, and luxury can be as heavy in the air as a fur cloak in the sun. If medieval clothing sometimes seemed extravagant to the point of absurdity, there was always someone in authority ready to step in and remind people that fashion was not meant to be a free-for-all, and that reminder usually came in the form of sumptuary laws. Those long lists of rules issued by kings, councils, or city magistrates dictating who could wear what, when, and sometimes even how much. The official reason given was almost always the same: to preserve order and morality, to prevent social confusion, and to make sure that peasants did not strut about looking like lords or merchants, did not parade themselves as dukes. For if clothing blurred the lines between classes, then society itself might appear to wobble. It is a well-accepted fact that such laws appeared all across Europe from the 13th century onward, from England to Florence to the Holy Roman Empire, and they covered an astonishing range of details, from the length of sleeves to the type of embroidery permitted on collars. Yet when you read through the surviving lists, you cannot help but laugh at some of the specifics, as if entire councils of serious men once sat together debating the maximum width of a lady-ass belt buckle, or how many buttons could be tolerated on a merchant-s jacket. The quirky detail lies in how frequently these laws were ignored, bent, or mocked, because while an ordinance might solemnly declare that no one below the rank of knight could wear velvet, trimmed with ermine, there are plenty of records of merchants' wives appearing at festivals in exactly such outfits, smiling sweetly, as though they had never read the decree. Fines were common, but they became almost a badge of honor, proof that one's wealth was great enough to risk paying a penalty for the pleasure of wearing silk stockings or a hat lined with fur. Historians still wonder about how effective these laws really were. Were they serious attempts to control fashion, or simply another way for city treasuries to collect money from the ambitious? Some argue that they were a reflection of anxiety in a world where merchants and bankers were rising in power, blurring the traditional lines between nobility and commoners, and so clothing became the battleground where authority attempted to reassert control. Imagine a wedding feast where half the guests are secretly flaunting forbidden fabrics, whispering nervously about whether the city inspector might notice, while the other half smirk knowingly at the hypocrisy of officials whose own families probably wore the same. It must have been a curious spectacle, a hall glittering with velvet and gold thread, each garment both a fashion statement and a small act of rebellion, each guest measuring how far they could stretch the rules before a fine arrived at their door. And yet, despite the mockery, the laws persisted for centuries, a reminder that clothing was never just decoration, but also a visible script of identity, one that governments tried again and again to edit. Perhaps the most amusing thought is that in every age people have been told what they can and cannot wear. And in every age people have responded the same way, by bending the rules, by laughing quietly, and by wearing what they pleased anyway, even if it meant being scolded by a councilman in a fur-lined robe, who probably should not have been wearing it either. Head coverings in the medieval world were far more than a scrap of cloth to keep out the cold or a shield from the summer sun. They were intricate codes of status, modesty, fashion, and sometimes quiet rebellion, wrapping entire stories around a person's head in folds of linen, velvet, or silk. To walk through a medieval town square was to be greeted not only by the noise of horses, hooves, and the smell of bread from an oven, but also by a forest of fabrics bobbing, draping, and fluttering above the crowd, each one whispering a message about who belonged to which class, who was married, who was devout, who was daring, and who had perhaps spent too much money on pins. The simplest and in many ways most respectable was the wimple, a long strip of linen that wrapped under the chin and across the neck, covering hair and skin with a modest frame that lent its wearer a calm dignity, the kind that artists adored when painting saints. This was especially associated with married women and with piety, and it is a widely accepted fact that the church encouraged women to cover their hair, considering it a symbol of vanity or temptation. Yet even here, fashion found its way in, because while one woman might wear her wimple plain and serviceable, another might starch hers into crisp folds that gleamed white in the sunlight, or embroider the edge with delicate designs, or pin a veil over the top to create a layered effect that drew admiring glances. And then there were veils themselves, sometimes no more than a sheer rectangle, pinned to the crown of the head, sometimes flowing to the waist, sometimes arranged in complex folds that took more patience than most of us devote to our entire wardrobes. A veil could be soft and demure or tall and dramatic, especially when pinned over the famous hennin, that towering cone-shaped hat that seemed less a piece of clothing than an architectural challenge. But the fascination lies not only in the appearance, but in the meanings people layered into these coverings. Chroniclers and poets hint that headwear could serve as a subtle language in itself, a tilt of a veil or a way of folding cloth, sending quiet messages across a hall. A lady adjusting her veil just so might be signaling mild interest in a suitor, while another might draw hers forward like a curtain to indicate cool disapproval. Whether such a full code truly existed, or whether later writers exaggerated the possibilities, it leaves us wondering how many glances, how many unspoken words were exchanged in the shifting folds of linen at feasts and markets. The quirky detail appears in satirical poetry, which jokes about women using veils so long and translucent that they barely covered anything at all, mocking the idea of modesty while still technically obeying the letter of the law. The irony of being covered and uncovered at the same time was not lost on contemporaries, and some moralists fumed that fashion had twisted piety into vanity. Yet no sermon, no law, no scolding ever seemed to succeed in curbing the creativity of medieval headwear. Men too carried on their own experiments above the shoulders. The chaperone, for instance, began as a hood with a long trailing tail called a liripipe, and over time young men developed the habit of wrapping the liripipe around their heads in increasingly elaborate ways, until the once simple hood became an accessory that could rival the complexity of a Lady S veil. Artists depicted men with liripipes dangling to their knees, tied into knots, or looped dramatically like scarves, and one satirist grumbled that young men spent more time arranging their headgear than they did reciting prayers. Here again lies the humor of history. The eternal complaint that youth spend too much time fussing with fashion is hardly a modern invention. Another accepted fact is that many of these head coverings served practical purposes too. Hoods kept out rain and wind. Veils shielded hair from dust. Coifs, the small tight caps often worn under other hats, helped pin elaborate styles in place. Yet practicality was never the end of the story, for a veil that shielded from dust could just as easily flutter to reveal a flash of hair. And a liripipe that kept out the wind could also trail dramatically behind a man as he strutted through the town square, declaring himself fashionable even while his feet were caked in mud. Historians still debate just how much of this language of headwear was conscious, how much was deliberate signaling, and how much was simply hindsight imposed by satirical observers. Was a lady truly sending messages with the angle of her veil, or was she merely adjusting it because pins were slippery and starch was itchy? Was a young man winding his liripipe into a knot to impress onlookers, or simply because he found it amusing? The absence of definitive answers leaves space for imagination, and perhaps that is what makes this corner of fashion so captivating. It reminds us that clothing is never just fabric. It is behavior, identity, theater, and sometimes comedy. The comedy, in fact, is easy to picture. Imagine a crowded church service where half the women wear stiffly starched wimples that squeak faintly as they shift, while the other half sport translucent veils fluttering into candles, and the men tug distractedly at liripipes that dangle into their neighbors' laps. The priest preaches solemnly about humility, while before his eyes an entire congregation fidgets, adjusts, flutters, and knots their head coverings like restless birds rearranging feathers. Outside, in the market, merchants shout prices while customers shade their eyes with veils pinned so wide they resemble sails, and a group of apprentices joke about whose liripipe is longest, dangling theirs across barrels in mock competition. Somewhere in a corner, a barber pins a coif snugly to a customer's head before fitting him with a hood, shaking his head at the endless inventions of youth. And at every level, the message is there. This is who I am. This is what I can afford. This is how I want to be seen. The beauty of medieval head coverings lies in their transience. Linen yellowed, veils tore, pins rusted, but the meanings carried by those objects shifted constantly, fluid as the folds of fabric themselves. We are left with illuminations, carvings, poems, and a handful of surviving pieces, fragile ghosts of a world where an angle of cloth could make or break an impression. And perhaps the most lingering question is this: how much of that subtlety have we lost? If we could walk into a medieval hall today, would we read the veils and liripipes fluently, understanding at a glance who was flirting, who was proud, who was humble, and who was breaking the rules? Or would we only admire the spectacle and miss the language entirely, smiling at the style while the message slipped quietly past us, hidden once more in folds of forgotten linen? When we think of armor, the image that usually comes to mind is one of battlefields and knights thundering across fields with lances lowered. But in the later Middle Ages, armor was not only a matter of war, it became fashion, a glittering accessory that could appear in court as easily as in combat. A curious reminder that humans will turn almost anything into decoration if given enough time. By the 14th and 15th centuries, full suits of plate armor were being perfected in Europe, especially in places like Milan and Nuremberg, where smiths crafted steel so polished it gleamed like mirrors, reflecting torchlight in banquet halls. And while such suits were of course intended for protection, it is a well-accepted fact that elements of armor, breastplates, gauntlets, even entire cuirasses, sometimes appeared in ceremonial settings, worn not because arrows were expected to fly through the dining hall, but because shining steel simply looked impressive. To wear armor at court was to display wealth as much as strength, for a good suit required immense skill to produce, fitted carefully to the body, costing more than many peasants would earn in a lifetime. Yet there is something faintly amusing about the image of noblemen striding through festivals or tournaments, with half their bodies encased in gleaming metal, bowing stiffly to ladies, while the joints squeaked faintly, or lifting goblets with gauntleted hands that clinked against the rim. The quirky detail lies in how armor sometimes crossed the line fully into costume. There are records of richly gilded suits, etched with vines, painted with heraldic animals, or even inlaid with silver and gold so delicate that to wear them in actual battle would have been folly. One Italian prince famously had armor enameled in bright colors, transforming himself into a walking mosaic, a sight as dazzling as it was impractical. Historians still wonder about the balance between utility and vanity in these pieces. Were they truly meant to function in emergencies, or were some designed purely as displays, armor that looked fierce but would crumple in the first serious clash? Whatever the answer, the fact remains that by the later medieval period, armor had entered the realm of fashion, and knights paraded in it not only on battlefields, but in tournaments staged for entertainment, where jousts were as much performance as practice. In those arenas, armor was like a tailored suit, designed to impress the crowd, to shine brighter than a rival's, to proclaim both wealth and daring. And beyond tournaments, even elements of armor slipped into daily wear. A gorget, the plate that protected the throat, might be worn by courtiers as a stylish accessory, while decorative daggers and swords jingled at the hips of men who had not seen battle in years. The humor of this transformation is easy to imagine: a hall full of nobles clanking gently every time they sat down, servants groaning as they polished steel breastplates for feasts instead of for war, and young squires tripping over greaves while trying to keep up with their lords. At times, the blending of armor and fashion reached the absurd, with accounts of men wearing codpieces shaped like miniature shields or helmets, as if to extend martial style into every possible corner of the body. And yet, beneath the laughter, the symbolism was clear. Armor as fashion meant identity as much as protection, a way of saying, I am powerful, I am wealthy, I am untouchable. For peasants watching from the crowd, the gleam of steel must have been both awe-inspiring and faintly ridiculous, a reminder of the gulf between their woolen tunics and the mirrored plates of nobility. The question lingers: did the nobles themselves feel proud or secretly uncomfortable beneath the weight, knowing that their armor was less a shield and more a showpiece? Perhaps both, for fashion has always demanded a little discomfort in exchange for admiration. And so the image remains. A twilight feast in a great hall, candles flickering on polished steel knights and courtiers, striding like living statues. Their armor not needed for battle, but worn anyway because even in a world of silks and jewels, nothing quite caught the eye, like the gleam of steel turned into fashion. If medieval fashion loved anything, it was the chance to add just a little more sparkle. And while crowns, rings, and necklaces might seem like obvious homes for jewels, people of the later Middle Ages were not content to stop there, scattering gems across cloaks, belts, gloves, and even shoes, until it seemed as if every possible surface of clothing had been turned into a stage for glitter. To step into a noble court was to be dazzled not only by candlelight, but by the reflections of dozens of small stones stitched into hems, sewn along sleeves, and pressed into buckles, each one gleaming like a tiny star whenever the wearer moved. It is a well-accepted fact that precious stones such as sapphires, rubies, emeralds, and pearls were status markers, highly prized across Europe, imported at great expense through trade routes stretching from India, Persia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. But the quirky detail comes in the more unexpected placements. Chronicles describe nobles with gemstones decorating the tips of shoes so that when they walked, their every step flashed with light, or men who wore belts so thickly encrusted with jewels that they jingled with every movement, half ornament and half inconvenience. Gloves, too, were sometimes set with pearls, making the simple act of clapping at a feast sound like a small percussion performance. Even horse bridles could be decorated, turning animals into glittering accessories that reflected the wealth of their riders. One traveler to Burgundy remarked on the spectacle of knights parading with gemstones sewn into their cloaks, the candlelight of the great hall shimmering across them so brightly that the entire procession looked like a moving constellation. Historians still wonder about the practicality of these jeweled garments. Were they truly worn every day? Or were many of them reserved for great feasts, ceremonies, and weddings, when spectacle mattered more than comfort? Surviving inventories suggest that nobles invested heavily in such ornamentation, with lists of gowns embroidered with hundreds of pearls, each one carefully noted as if they were coins in a treasury. And yet, the humor of it is never far from the surface. Imagine a noble trying to dance while gemstones stitched to his shoes catch on the hem of his partneress' gown, or a lady attempting to raise a jeweled glove to her lips, only to find it so stiff with pearls that she can barely bend her fingers. There are even stories of thieves cutting jewels directly off clothing at crowded festivals, slipping a knife under a cloak, to snip away pearls, while the wearer remained oblivious. To modernize, there is something almost excessive about the idea of turning practical items like belts or boots into treasure chests. But for medieval people, the message was clear. Wealth was not something to be hidden away in coffers. It was to be worn, to be displayed, to shimmer and shine in every corner of daily life. Some garments became so encrusted with jewels that they approached absurdity, weighing down the wearer, until walking was an effort. But still they were admired because weight itself was a form of prestige. The heavier the garment, the richer the person inside it must be. And yet, there is something poignant too, for many of these jeweled items have long since been dismantled, the stones reused, the fabric rotted away, leaving only descriptions in inventories and the occasional fragment in museums. We are left to wonder what it must have been like to stand in one of those halls lit only by torches and candles, and see dozens of nobles gleaming like stars, every step a flash, every gesture a twinkle, until the entire gathering resembled the night sky turned inside out. Perhaps the most enduring question is whether people truly admired such displays or quietly rolled their eyes, muttering that no one needed rubies on their boots, but no one dared say it aloud. Fashion has always balanced on that edge between admiration and absurdity, and medieval jewels in strange places were no different. Beautiful, inconvenient, sometimes laughable, and always unforgettable. Every fashion has its moment, and just as the towering hennins, glittering jewels, and clattering patterns of the later Middle Ages reached their peak, the tide of style slowly began to shift towards something new, as the 15th century gave way to the 16th, and the Renaissance swept across Europe with its love of symmetry, balance, and a very different sense of elegance. The elaborate layering of medieval gowns began to slim into more tailored silhouettes, sleeves grew closer to the arm instead of exploding into wings of fabric, and shoes lost some of their absurd length, settling into forms that were still decorative, but less dangerous for navigating stairs. It is a well-accepted fact that these changes reflected deeper cultural transformations. The Renaissance obsession with classical antiquity encouraged clothing that seemed more orderly, more harmonious, echoing the balanced proportions admired in Roman statues and Greek ideals. Yet the medieval world did not vanish overnight, and for a time one could see the overlap of styles, where an older noblewoman clung stubbornly to her cone-shaped hennin, while her daughter appeared beside her in a rounded bonnet that looked startlingly modern, or where an elderly knight proudly wore gilded armor at a festival, while younger courtiers turned up in softer fabrics, preferring embroidered silk doublets to steel breastplates. The quirky detail appears in accounts of tailors grumbling during this transitional period because clients would arrive demanding garments that fused both eras, a gown with the width of a farthingale, but the fitted waist of a Renaissance corset, or shoes that combined the upward curve of poulaines with the blocky shape of a new Italian heel. These hybrid fashions may not have lasted long, but they must have looked extraordinary, a visual tug-of-war between centuries stitched together with needle and thread. Historians still wonder how ordinary people perceived these changes. Did they sigh with relief when hoop skirts shrank and hennins disappeared, or did they mourn the loss of grandeur, feeling that something magical had been swept away in favor of neatness and restraint? Change was uneven too. In some towns, medieval styles lingered stubbornly with sumptuary laws still enforced, while in the cities of Italy and Burgundy, Renaissance fashions raced ahead, carried by wealthy bankers and merchants who wanted to appear as modern as the art they were commissioning. Imagine a great hall in that moment of overlap, half the guests in shimmering Renaissance brocades, the other half still rustling in layered medieval robes, a scene of contrast where old jokes about codpieces mingled with new compliments about embroidery. For peasants and laborers, the transition mattered little, for their clothes remained much the same: sturdy wool, simple tunics, functional shoes, more concerned with survival than with the latest trends of Milan. Yet for the nobility, the end of medieval style marked not only a change of fashion but a change of worldview. The Renaissance was about control, perspective, and order, And so clothing followed suit, shedding the chaos of oversized hats, exaggerated shoes, and extravagant beards in favor of lines that appeared deliberate, almost mathematical. Still, memory clung to the old excess, and even centuries later people remembered with amusement the days when skirts filled rooms and shoes curled upward like fishing hooks. The humor of history is that what once seemed natural and even dignified soon becomes laughable in hindsight, and medieval fashion was no exception. And so as the 16th century dawned, the glitter of jewels sewn into cloaks, the clouds of perfume stronger than soap, the clang of armor worn as decoration, all of it slowly faded, leaving behind only records, illustrations, and the occasional surviving garment in a museum. What we cannot know for certain, what historians still debate, is how people felt in those exact moments when one world gave way to another. Did they know they were living through a fashion revolution, or did they simply wake up one morning, look at their sleeves and think, "This looks a little out of date"? Fashion always carries that strange blend of continuity and rupture, of nostalgia and impatience, and medieval clothing's end was no different. The great irony is that many of the trends mocked in their own time have become beloved curiosities for us, reminders of how inventive, playful, and gloriously impractical humans can be when dressing themselves. And so the end of medieval style was not really an end at all, but a transformation, the same endless cycle that ensures we will always look back at the past with both admiration and a gentle laugh, marveling at how people once dressed themselves in ways that were heavy, inconvenient, ridiculous, and unforgettable. To look back at the medieval world of clothing is to step once more into streets lined with timber-framed houses and echoing with the sound of bells. To see men and women moving through the rhythms of daily life while wrapped in garments that seem at once extraordinary and ordinary, absurd and beautiful, deeply impractical, yet perfectly logical within their own time. And as you imagine this world receding slowly into memory, it becomes clear that fashion was not simply a matter of appearance, but a kind of language, a code woven into fabric that told people where they stood in the social order, what they believed, what they hoped, and sometimes even what they wanted to hide. One can picture the morning ritual of a noblewoman in her chamber, servants bustling around her as they assemble layer upon layer of linen and silk, pinning veils and arranging folds of fabric with the care of sculptors, while outside her window a market girl ties a simple kerchief over her hair and pulls on a woolen gown faded from years of wear, both women stepping into the same day but into different worlds defined by cloth. The accepted fact here is that clothing in the Middle Ages consumed extraordinary resources. Sheep raised for wool, flax for linen dyes, imported along dangerous trade routes, silks brought from Byzantium or later from China through the Silk Road, each garment the end point of a global story that stretched far beyond the narrow lanes of a village. Yet the quirky detail comes when you think about how people treated these clothes once they were made. Because unlike today, when fashion is fleeting and closets overflow, medieval garments were precious, repaired again and again, sleeves detached and resewn to follow new trends, hems unpicked and lengthened, fabric inherited from parent to child until finally cut into smaller pieces for pillows or even used as cleaning rags, which means that a dress that began as a court gown might end its life as a humble scrap in a kitchen. And still, even in their final stages, clothes carried meaning. A patched cloak marked someone as poor, a gleaming new tunic signaled prosperity. A fur-lined mantle announced prestige, and the layers upon layers of symbolism turned every marketplace into a theater of fabric. Historians still wonder how people truly felt about these garments. Did they laugh at their own shoes when they tripped on poulains? Did they sigh with relief when removing stiff hennins at night? Did they ever secretly resent the weight of furs in summer or the ache of jewels stitched into belts? Or were these inconveniences invisible to them, absorbed into the natural order of life much as we accept tight collars or high heels today? The question lingers because clothing is one of the most intimate parts of history. We wear it against our skin, we live inside it, and yet it is also one of the most theatrical, a mask and a mirror all at once. As centuries passed and Renaissance styles began to replace medieval extravagance, many of these fashions faded, yet echoes remained, lingering in rural corners or in ceremonial traditions. A hennin might survive in folk costumes, a liripipe in a comic play, a jeweled shoe remembered in a tale of a great lady who dazzled a feast. And when we laugh at these fashions now, at the hoop skirts too wide for doors, or the codpieces too large for dignity, we are laughing not at a vanished world, but at ourselves, because the same patterns repeat endlessly. The desire to stand out, to impress, to exaggerate until the line between elegance and absurdity blurs. Imagine a medieval merchant gazing at us today, shaking his head at our sneakers branded with glowing logos, our suits worn in sweltering summer offices, our jeans torn deliberately at the knees. Would he think us more practical than he was? Or just as strange in our own way? Perhaps both. The truth is that fashion always carries contradiction. It is at once deeply personal and loudly public, rooted in necessity, yet soaring into pure performance. And so, to close this long walk through the wardrobes of the Middle Ages, picture again the market at dusk, stalls closing, the smell of bread and smoke drifting through the air. A young man ties his liripipe into a jaunty knot, hoping someone will notice. A noblewoman carefully lifts her hoop skirt sideways to step through a door, servants hiding smiles. A shoemaker displays patterns that clack on the cobbles, proud of his noisy craft. A fur-clad merchant dabs his brow with a cloth, but refuses to remove his mantle. A barber trims a beard into a sharp fork while humming a tune. Around them, peasants in plain tunics hurry home, their clothes patched but sturdy, no less meaningful in their simplicity than the gilded gowns of nobles. All of them are speaking in the language of fashion, a language that historians translate imperfectly through scraps of fabric, illustrations in manuscripts, complaints in sermons, and jokes in poems. The world they created may be gone, but in its place remains a story stitched into memory. Of shoes that curled, hats that towered, skirts that sprawled, perfumes that choked, jewels that twinkled in odd corners, and laws that tried in vain to keep people from being inventive. Perhaps the greatest truth of all is that fashion was never just about clothing. It was about being seen, remembered, admired, or even ridiculed, and that is why we still care to look back, still smile, still shake our heads at the glittering, inconvenient, marvelous theatre of medieval dress. And as the candles burn low in that imagined hall, their light flickering across linen and silk steel and fur jewels and shoes, we can let the scene settle gently into stillness. The noise fading, the garments laid aside, the people themselves, slipping into shadows of time, leaving us with only the soft rustle of fabric in memory. Now that the journey through medieval fashion has unfolded in all its curious colors and glittering details, it is time to let the noise of the markets, the clatter of patterns on cobbles, the rustle of brocade sleeves, and the whispered laughter about hennins and codpieces drift quietly away, as if the entire medieval town you have been wandering through has begun to close its shutters for the night, each sound growing softer, each light dimming until the world is wrapped in calm. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a narrow street, the timber-framed houses leaning inward as if to shelter the path, their upper stories heavy with shadows, and one by one, candles in the windows are being snuffed out, leaving only faint orange glows behind the shutters. The smell of bread still lingers, warm and yeasty, but now it mixes with the cooler scents of night air, damp stone, and wood smoke curling lazily from chimneys. The square that once bustled with vendors is emptying, their stalls folded, their voices fading into the distance until only the quiet remains. A quiet so deep that you can hear the faint creak of a sign swaying in the breeze and the far-off bark of a dog settling down outside a cottage. It is a quiet that seems to soften your thoughts, to ease the edges of memory until the details of poulaines and jewels and veils no longer clamor for attention, but rest instead like folded garments at the end of the day. As you walk further into this stillness, the sky above deepens into velvet, the last traces of blue giving way to the dark expanse of night, pricked by a scatter of stars. The moon rises slowly, washing the rooftops in silver, and you notice how even the most elaborate fashions of the day, the silks and satins and fur-lined cloaks, now seem muted, transformed by moonlight into shapes without color, draped quietly across benches or hung carefully on pegs, no longer shouting of wealth or status, but resting like any other fabric waiting for the dawn. The clatter of armor has gone silent too, breastplates and gauntlets resting on stands, no longer displays of pride but cool steel cooling further in the night air. As if the very objects themselves have grown weary of glittering, and now prefer the peace of shadow. There is a kind of comfort in this, knowing that even the noisiest, most impractical fashions must eventually be set aside, and in that moment they become simply cloth and metal, once more stripped of their power, harmless and still. Your steps carry you toward the edge of the town, where the buildings thin and fields begin, and the road stretches ahead, lined with hedges whispering softly in the breeze. Here, away from the clamor of history, the stars shine brighter, the silence deeper, and you feel the rhythm of your own breath begin to slow, matching the gentle sway of the hedges, the quiet sigh of the night wind. Every breath in feels cool and spacious, like inhaling starlight, and every breath out feels heavier, like letting go of centuries of clattering shoes and towering hats, exhaling them into the night where they vanish like mist. The ground beneath your feet feels solid and kind, the path worn smooth by countless others who once walked it, and you sense their presence faintly. The long parade of people who dressed themselves in veils and liripipes and jeweled gloves, all of them long gone but somehow still lingering in the memory of fabric and stone. They are no longer straining to impress, no longer worrying about whether their sleeves are wide enough or their shoes too long. They are simply part of the quiet now, folded into time like garments put away for good. As you walk, you imagine them resting too in houses and castles, peasants in woolen tunics drifting into dreams, nobles sinking heavily beneath fur-lined blankets, knights sighing with relief as armor is removed, children curled up beside the hearth all breathing slowly, their lives paused by sleep. The fashion, the pride, the glitter, all of it has dissolved into stillness. And in that stillness, you realize how universal the act of rest is, how every century, no matter how loud or absurd its clothing, eventually comes to the same quiet pause. You let this thought deepen in you, each breath slower now, each step softer, until you find yourself on a small hill just outside the town, looking back at it under the moonlight. The rooftops gleam faintly silver, the church steeple points up toward the stars, and the fields stretch out like a blanket across the earth. The town is asleep, the fashions tucked away, the noise gone, and in that calm, you feel the weight of your own body ease, as if you too are being folded gently into rest. The air is cool and carries the faint smell of hay, and as you lie back in the grass, you feel how soft it is beneath you. The blades bending without complaint, cradling you in a way that makes you feel at once small and infinite, a part of something larger. The stars above are countless, steady and calm, and you begin to see them not just as lights but as tiny jewels, scattered more beautifully than any cloak ever embroidered, more endless than any crown ever adorned. They are the jewels of the sky, stitched into the fabric of night, and they will never fade, never be pawned, never be sewn into gloves so impractical they make clapping ridiculous. They simply shine, effortlessly, endlessly. The thought makes you smile faintly, and the smile softens as your eyes grow heavier. The medieval world slips further away now, its noise forgotten, its colors dimmed, and what remains is only this feeling of quiet, of being safe, of being allowed to rest. Your breathing is slow, steady, gentle, each inhale cool, each exhale warm, and with every breath you sink deeper into calm. The grass beneath you supports you like the softest bed, the night sky above watches over you with quiet patience, and the centuries themselves seem to fold closed around you like a curtain, protecting you from the noise of the past, leaving you with only stillness. Let your body grow heavier, let your mind grow softer. Let the images of shoes and veils and jewels fade into nothing, as if they were costumes in a play that has ended. The stage darkened, the audience gone, the theater silent. What remains is rest, and rest is enough. And so as the last of the medieval fashions settle into the hush of memory, you may picture the garments folded carefully into wooden chests, the air inside smelling faintly of cedar and beeswax, where heavy cloaks rest beside thin summer tunics, where jeweled belts lie coiled like sleeping serpents, and where linen veils soften into the corners like pale clouds. The chest is closed, the latch clicks, and with that small sound, the centuries themselves seem to sigh, content to be left alone for the night. Above, the rafters creak as the wind slips through, a quiet reminder that the world continues even when the noise of fashion and pride has ceased, and you feel yourself drawn into the rhythm of that continuity, steady, calm, timeless. Outside the window of this imagined chamber, the moon drifts higher, pulling shadows across the fields, stretching them long and soft like ribbons of ink. The hedges whisper gently, the trees sway with leaves that rustle like distant silk, and in every sound there is the same message. It is time to rest. Your breath deepens as you walk further into this quiet landscape. The night wider now, the stars higher, the path softer beneath your feet. Each step feels lighter, as though you are not walking on earth but on the memory of it, as if the world itself has grown weightless. Far in the distance you can almost hear the faint toll of a bell, not loud, not urgent, but like the heartbeat of time itself, marking not the hours of work or prayer, but the hours of rest, calling every creature into stillness. Imagine the town behind you, now fully asleep, chimneys dark, shutters closed, dogs curled into silence, cats tucked in haylofts, children wrapped in blankets, while dreams carry them far from patched tunics or fur mantles. Even the castles are quiet, the tapestries still, the grand halls empty of clattering guests, the echo of laughter dissolved into the stones. Knights who once strode in armor now sleep with only the weight of blankets. Ladies who once balanced towering hennins rest their heads on pillows filled with feathers. Apprentices and peasants alike lie side by side in the democracy of slumber, equal at last in this most necessary fashion of all, the fashion of sleep. The fields around you shimmer faintly under moonlight, the dew forming slowly on grass, tiny beads of silver, more delicate than pearls stitched into any glove. The hedges are threaded with spiderwebs that glisten in starlight, like necklaces finer than any court jeweler could craft. The earth has its own ornaments, patient and perfect, offered freely to any who look, and in this quiet moment you realize how small the efforts of human fashion seem beside the effortless beauty of night. The cool air brushes your skin, gentle as silk, and carries with it the scent of damp soil and faint wood smoke, grounding you in a calm that has no need of jewels or feathers or starch. Every breath draws in this calm, and every exhale releases the clutter of thought, until what remains is only rhythm, steady and slow like the turning of seasons. You lie back again, perhaps on a hillside now, where the grass cushions you like the softest bedding, where the curve of the land holds you as kindly as any mattress. The stars overhead do not move quickly, they drift with patience, reminding you that all things change in their own time, that no fashion, no noise, no worry ever lasts forever. It is comforting to imagine that long after the hennins and poulains disappeared, long after the jeweled cloaks faded into dust, these same stars continue to shine unbothered, unchanging, waiting for eyes to look upward. Perhaps peasants once lay in these same fields, resting after long days, gazing upward with the same mixture of wonder and fatigue, seeing the same constellations and feeling the same smallness and peace. Perhaps even nobles, wrapped in furs heavier than comfort, stole moments in gardens at night, glancing upward when no one was looking, and found themselves humbled by the vastness above. In those moments, every jewel on earth must have felt trivial compared to the scatter of jewels in the sky. And so your breath slows further, shoulders sinking, limbs growing heavier, eyelids softer. The medieval town fades completely now. Its fashions folded, its noise dissolved, and all that surrounds you is this endless calm night. The grass hums faintly with crickets, the air cools, the stars keep watch. You feel yourself drifting not only into sleep, but into continuity, joining the countless others across centuries who laid their burdens aside at night, who forgot their shoes, their veils, their cloaks, their armor, and simply rested safe under the same stars. The rhythm of your breath is theirs, the heaviness in your body is theirs, and in that shared rhythm there is comfort. You are not alone. You are part of an ancient pattern that has always known how to rest. And now, let your thoughts soften completely. Let the images of velvet and linen, silk and steel, fur and feathers drift like leaves down a quiet stream, moving further from you until they are gone. There is no need to hold on, no need to recall. No need to adjust or arrange, only to release. The night has taken over, gentle and patient, and it will carry you the rest of the way. Breathe once more, slowly, deeply, and allow yourself to fall not into history but into sleep, the truest and most timeless fashion of all.